Fundamentally, Don't Starve is a game all about analyzing your options and making use of the options that you have at your disposal. So when it comes to guides about this game, you can make guides of certain scenarios and guides of certain seasons and certain predicaments and things of that nature. But ultimately, what everything is going to boil down to is being able to tell what options you have, how easy it is to get those options, and how reliable they are. So I'm going to be breaking down this guide based off of things like health, sanity, and hunger, because fundamentally those are the only stats you have to manage. Health being probably the most important one, since it's just distance away from death, is pretty easy to lose, all things considered. When it comes to losing health, the biggest threat is just enemies, and avoiding enemies is something that can be easily done if you just keep calm and evaluate your options. Many times I see a lot of new players kind of struggle with that, because they just panic and don't know what to do whenever they get approached by an enemy. Usually your options tend to be pretty large. Beefalo tend to be a pretty good option for smaller enemies, such as hordes of spiders, hordes of hounds, things of that nature, but they tend to suffer a lot against bosses, such as deerclops and bearger and things of that nature. The pros of Beefalo are that they're passive in quite a few seasons, and they can easily aggro onto other things because you could just run straight through them if they aren't in mating season. They can clear out minor threats pretty easily. The biggest issue is that they are seasonal, so if they are in mating season, they will become a hostile mob and they will target you. They're limited in supply, in that if you kill an entire herd, then that herd is just deleted. They're kind of out of the way unless you base near them, which typically Beefalo don't tend to be near anything that's too majorly important. Overall, Beefalo are a good option for small trash enemies, but they aren't the best ones as time goes on. Leading hostile mobs to spiders is definitely a good option because they are easily accessible and they aggro onto most everything, as well as the fact that they're found most everywhere in the map. The issue with it is that spiders aggro onto the players, and it can be tricky to maneuver around the web, so more often than not, if you lead things to spiders, then you have to deal with spiders. Fundamentally though, the option that you have to keep in mind in most every combat scenario is simply just running away. The benefits to just running away are it's the easiest option for one, it costs little to nothing, and all you have to do is you just run in one direction, and for the most part, you will never take damage because you outrun most things in this game. Now, the obvious downside of this is that it doesn't deal with the threat at hand. If you just run away from whatever hound wave you're facing or whatever spiders you're facing, those spiders and those hounds are still going to be there. This also doesn't result in any loot, so if you just run away, then obviously the thing isn't going to be dead to drop its stuff. And it takes quite a while if the enemy that you're trying to run away from is persistent enough, such as hounds. Fighting is also a good option. It is probably the most immediately evident one to more experienced players, and it deals with the problem. It's also just a universally applicable strategy to just murder all of them. The issue with this is it requires you to be prepped for a fight, so carrying a weapon, whether that be anything from an axe to a dark sword on you, or even just armor, can be a hindrance to you, especially if you don't want to clog up your inventory unnecessarily. It also takes up resources just because you have to get new weapons and get new armor. And it also needs some degree of knowledge. Even if you are familiar in kiting things, the kiting pattern does wax and wane depending on how many of one certain enemy there are and what season it might be, because you might be overheating or freezing. I would recommend you look up a guide on how to kite most every enemy if you're struggling with this, but for the most part, you can try to get one hit and then run away, and then repeat that until you feel comfortable enough to hit them more than one time. Different enemies in this game have different kiting patterns, so all you really have to do is practice, practice, practice. So that's how to avoid losing health. Regaining health in the event that you do lose the health anyways is pretty easy, all things considered. Your crockpot is probably going to be one of your best options in the game for healing, just because crockpot recipes tend to be easy to come by, as well as just being very good in terms of regenning health. Some very early options for the game are trail mix, blue mushrooms, pierogi, and butterflies. Trail mix you just need berries and birch nuts for, which you could get those things basically any time in autumn. So when you first load into the game, if you rush a crockpot by mining a bunch of things, setting some trees on fire, then trail mix is pretty easily accessible. Pierogi tends to be people's go-to just because the resources themselves are pretty easy to gather. You just need vegetables, eggs, and meat, which what most people tend to do is they tend to use things like rock fruit, kelp, or even just something as simple as cactus. Use that as the vegetable, and for meat and eggs, you could feed meat to a bird, and that'll spit out an egg, and then you just need one additional meat after that. Overall, familiarizing yourself with ways to get all of these, like maybe you get your meat from a spider farm, maybe you get your meat from hounds, maybe you get your meat from pigs, goats, whatever your source of meat is, you should definitely try expanding it so that you have more and more options. Blue mushrooms tend to be pretty plentiful, all things considered. The benefits of it is that it's easy to get a lot of them in places like the deciduous biome or even just the blue mushroom forest. The downsides are that your sanity ends up dropping, as well as they're only available in a certain section of the day, that being nighttime. Overall, if you come across a blue mushroom, it isn't a bad idea to just pick it and have it on you in case you need to regain that health. Or if you're already at a health deficit and you see one, feel free to just pick it. I wouldn't really recommend digging them up just because they don't regrow as fast as I would like them to, just due to natural world regeneration. So just having the option there is plenty for most people at any given point in time. Honey is also a fine healing method early on and also in late game. Just setting up one bee box or taking down a couple of hives will result in you getting honey. Setting up a bee box is definitely recommended regardless of the scenario, just because honey is such a valuable resource for you in regards to making food and also just healing. They heal for 3, but the benefit is that you get tons and tons at a time without really any interaction from you, the player. The issue with it is that you have to be familiar with bees. You have to be familiar with catching bees, dealing with bees in spring, as well as just the initial fighting the bees when they come out of the hive for you catching them. Once again, I would recommend you look up a kiting guide for them, since, you know, the one singular bee itself can be stun locked, but you might need to familiarize yourself with fighting hordes of bees at a time. Butterflies are also a really good healing source just for most characters and at most given points in time. The benefits are that they're plentiful in early game, and they heal for a respectable 8 HP per each one. The issue is that not everybody is comfortable with hitting Control F near butterflies, which is something that can be fixed since it's all just practice. The other biggest issue is that they're locked out during winter, so if that's your primary source of healing during the first autumn, then you're gonna have an issue in winter, which is why I would list every other healing option and just try to expand your option, because it's never a bad idea to get more and more options in your head so that you can, at any given point in time, look around you and analyze every single option that you have at any given point in time. The long and short of it is, if you don't know how to deal with a situation, you avoid it, you prep for it, and then later you deal with it. And then after that, you fall back on dealing with the consequences. Typically, the things that you end up fighting do benefit you more than they hinder you, since they themselves drop things that are pretty desirable most of the time. In regards to sanity isn't too big of an issue in this game, all things considered. So long as your sanity doesn't reach about below a third, you'll be fine probably. Keep that in mind going forward. Whenever your sanity gets lower than half, don't panic, because it is very easy to start freaking out and you actually tend to make more irrational decisions just based off of your state of mind. So the real key right here is just stay calm, analyze all your options. Once again, sanity itself is easier to manage than it seems if you deal with things that drain your sanity. Dusk and Dawn will passively drain your sanity by 5 points a minute, which is manageable. It isn't the worst thing in this game, but it's definitely just a tax that you're going to have to deal with. Something that I cannot stress enough is that you should not use garlands as your primary source of sanity. Garlands typically just aren't worth making, and it's usually better to just let the petals rot so that you could fertilize other crops. The biggest sanity drainers that people are going to encounter in this game are Dusk and Night, which once again drains your sanity by 5 points a minute. And this can be kind of offset with just a top hat, since the sanity that you gain during daytime with that top hat should be enough, combined with the fact that it skims off the top of your sanity drain during Dusk and Night, to where sanity isn't really that big of an issue if you just wear a top hat all the time. Spending extended periods of time near enemies also drains your sanity. Your best option here is either to distance yourself from enemies or just dealing with them by killing them, or getting other things to kill them. Raw meats also tend to drain your sanity, so you could just bypass that by cooking. Sanity is something that you're going to lose if you aren't aptly prepared for it, or if you don't have a Tam Shanter, which offsets sanity drain entirely for most characters. So ways to deal with being insane is pretty simple. Your primary option is just to kill the shadow monsters that appear to you. The benefits of this are nightmare fuel, and you get sanity whenever they die. The downside is that you need to know the kiting pattern, and in addition to that, if other players are at low sanity and you're near them, then you'll have to deal with their sanity monsters as well. Cooked cacti is pretty beneficial. It's pretty easy to get large amounts of cacti in this game, especially if you just know where the desert is, or better yet, if you base in the desert. The biggest issue with them is that they aren't relocatable, so they're locked into the desert at all times. You also get damage when you pick them, though that can be reduced by just wearing armor. Cooked greencaps is also a good option for dealing with sanity. The benefits are that they're everywhere, so most areas are going to have at least one cooked green mushroom, which would give you 15 sanity when you cook them. The biggest issue is that they are only available at dusk, so during the time where you're going to be losing sanity, but is it actually nighttime? The Tophat is a very underrated option since it's an easy source of sanity and typically enough to offset the sanity drain that you would passively experience. The biggest issue is that you have to kill spiders for it, which certain players might not be comfortable for, but just see it as an option more than anything else. Prototyping also gives you sanity, and you do get tons of sanity from it early on, because typically that's when you're prototyping things like boards, rope, cut stone, tools, backpacks, things of that nature. The biggest issue is that as time goes on, you aren't really incentivized to prototype a lot of things, because a lot of structures and items in this game tend to just fall into the category of a waste of resources, because you can spend those resources elsewhere and get better results from it. Hunger, despite the name of the game, is deceptively easy to manage. Most characters just lose a static 45 hunger a day, and can eat most any food. So these options are for the general character. Though you can't take what I say in this section and apply it to character-specific characters such as Wigfrid when I talk about meat, or Wirt when I talk about vegetable options. The crockpot is typically going to be your go-to whenever you manage hunger, since things in the crockpot tend to yield a bit more hunger than just things in their own. Meatballs typically are the go-to that people default to whenever they're first starting out the game, and it isn't terrible for strictly hunger, but it's easily outclassed by other crockpot recipes that you will probably have easy access to. Honey ham is the step up from meatballs, and it isn't bad. It heals for 20 and gives 75 hunger. It is a very basic resource that people tend to default to whenever they have a reasonable enough understanding about this game. The big reason people default to it is because its resources are really cheap, only requiring 2 units of meat and 1 honey. So the 2 units of meat could be anywhere between a monster meat and 2 morsels, or 2 frog legs, or even just 2 big meats. Basically anything that counts as a meat and is within a reasonable size. Bacon and eggs are essentially just honey ham, except they have a better spoilage time, meaning that they last longer in your inventory. Bacon and eggs also isn't bad, but it definitely does require a more consistent form of meat. Typically, the way people make this is they just have 2 big meat and 2 eggs. So that could be 4 meat in total if you give things like 2 morsels, that being frog legs or just small meat or things of that nature, to a bird in a bird cage, because it'll spit out eggs. Meaty Stew is definitely good for hunger, only requiring 3 big meats. Overall, it's pretty good, since you could just have 2 big meats, 1 monster meat, or 1 big meat, 1 monster meat, and 2 morsels. You definitely get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of hunger for Meaty Stew. As far as non-crockpot specific foods go, early on, you can rely basically entirely on berries and carrots. Rock fruit, if you have access to them, are insanely good for food, since they tend to come in large quantities and don't spoil whenever you don't mine them. So that means you could just carry a bunch of unbroken rock fruit and a pickaxe in your inventory, and you'll be set at most any given point in the game. Fundamentally, Don't Starve is a game all about analyzing all of your options at any given point in time. So just expanding on your game knowledge by either seeing what other people do, looking up guides like this one, and just experimenting with different options that suit your specific needs at most any given point in time are definitely something that is worth looking into. Just because the more options that you have at any given point in time, and the more options you know about, the better every subsequent game is going to be. It's really important to not get discouraged whenever you lose a world or you die for whatever reason, and just analyzing the area around you, understanding what went wrong and how to avoid it, can go a long way in this game. So hopefully this helped you in some way, shape, or form, even if it was just pointing out a mentality that you should have. But that's basically all I wanted to talk about, so until next time, bye-bye.